Litigation at RFK Human Rights, and I'll be your moderator today in this webinar. To get us started, I would like to give the floor to our president, Carrie Kennedy, for some welcome remarks. Please,
Thank
Carrie.
you, Angelita, and thank you for everyone joining us today. This is an exciting day. It's the launch of our guide to engaging the United States government on arbitrary and wrongful detention cases. We are grateful for your presence and engagement in this critical issue. In particular, I want to thank our wonderful guest speakers, Diane Foley, Jared Gensler, Andrew Fandiño, and Alina Steinhardt, all of whom bring deep expertise and insight in legal advocacy and mobilization. Today, we will explore how this guide can be used to drive the United States government to challenge arbitrary detentions, support detainees and their families, and hold countries that engage in this horrendous practice accountable. Every year, thousands of individuals around the world are held in detention without legal basis, due process, or fair trial. According to the United Nations, arbitrary detentions are reported in over 90 countries, affecting not only political dissidents and human rights defenders, but also journalists, minorities, migrants, and everyday citizens who are often denied basic legal safeguards. For decades, RFK Human Rights has worked in support of victims of arbitrary detention. From Egypt to Bangladesh to Venezuela, we fight for individuals who are held without due process or detained at the whim of repressive regimes. Our solidarity with and advocacy for victims of arbitrary detention has been at the core of our work since my mother, Ethel Kennedy, founded our organization, and that is why we dedicate the guide to her memory and to honor her staunch defense of those deprived of liberty for speaking their truth to power. In recent years, we've seen a disturbing rise in the use of detention as a tool of repression, silencing dissent, detaining people based on ethnicity or religion, and targeting vulnerable communities. This widespread misuse of detention powers is not just a legal issue. It is a human rights crisis and a challenge to the rule of law and human dignity. Arbitrary and wrongful detention are designed to isolate and repress. They are weapons designed to silence dissent, intended to strike fear in the hearts of human rights defenders, activists, journalists, and citizens more broadly, creating a chilling effect on society at large. Addressing arbitrary and wrongful detention and bringing those detained home isn't just about justice on an individual scale. It's about safeguarding the very foundations of democracy, the ability to speak out without the threat of a jail cell or a torture chamber. This issue transcends borders and ideologies. It is about defending human freedom, and each of us plays a crucial role in that defense. Time and again, we have witnessed the tireless dedication of mothers and fathers, children and friends, as they've sought to secure the safe return of their detained loved ones. But that battle shouldn't be undertaken alone. Our hope is that this guide provides tangible help and direction for victims of arbitrary detention and their families facing the maze of federal resources and programs. I want to recognize the team that drafted and reviewed the guide: Sarah Morsheimer, Basil Jamali, Ikechukwu Uzoma, and Angelita Bayans, as well as the many experts and victims whom the team had the privilege to speak to while working on this guide. Finally, I want to thank Open Society Foundations, the United States, for the generous support that allowed us to complete this guide and work on behalf of victims of arbitrary and wrongful detention. Thank you again for joining us. We hope this session equips you with the knowledge, motivation, and tools to start or continue your advocacy against arbitrary detention. Let's begin. Angelita?
Thank you so much, Carrie. And now, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Ikechukwu Uzoma, who's our Senior Staff Attorney for Africa and coordinated the drafting and finalization of this guide. Please, Ikechukwu.
Thank you so much, Angelita, and greetings to everyone. My name is Ikechukwu Uzoma, and it's my honor to present our new guide on engaging with the United States government on arbitrary and wrongful detention cases today. Following the return of Paul Rusesabagina to the United States after almost 1,000 days in arbitrary detention in Rwanda, and as Kerry described, part of our decades-long work on arbitrary detention, we thought about telling the story of the case, the Paul Rusesabagina case, but also reflecting the learnings that we had received from the long-term work on this issue, and to facilitate further engagement with our partners and with government actors in the area. And this was what birthed the idea of the guide, just helping families to ease the burden that the unfortunate incident of the arbitrary detention of their loved one places on them, and to navigate through what everyone agrees is a complex terrain of advocacy around arbitrary or wrongful detention cases. And so we designed a project that centered on expanding awareness and advocacy for stronger and broader United States engagement on arbitrary detention abroad. And as part of that initiative, the guide was birthed as, above all, a contribution to the collective efforts of many of the experts and family members and the lived experiences, actually, of our heroes, the survivors and pre-formally detained individuals, some of whom are in the room today or are on this call today. And the goal has always been to work hard towards making the arbitrary detention and wrongful detention response architecture of the United States more accessible and actionable for families and advocates. So to achieve this, we incorporated several narrative and presentation tools and approaches to ensure that even in the midst of the emotional turmoil of learning that a loved one has been detained and figuring out what the days, the weeks, the months, and sometimes the years would be in advocating for their release, we hope that this guide would provide immediate guidance with clarity and as much precision as we could muster in the pages of the guide. And so we begin the guide with plain language narrative explaining what mechanisms exist within the United States government to respond to arbitrary and wrongful detention. And further, the guide opens with definition of terms, acronyms, as well as an overview of the legal framework that exists within the United States government, whether it's on the executive side or how the legislature or Congress can also support advocacy in times of arbitrary and wrongful detention. We have a series of tables and charts outlining the roles of various executive branch entities that have arbitrary detention or wrongful detention responsibilities. One thing we didn't necessarily delve into was the fine history of the creation of these enterprises within the United States government. But I'm glad that we are joined today by some architects of that enterprise or some individuals who inspired that enterprise. And so I look forward to listening to them as well, and hoping that we'll learn a bit about the history of how all of this came through through advocacy. Of course, a pivotal finding for us, and which was not necessarily new, but became even stark as we got into the preparation of the guide or the conversations around the guide, was that while the 11th Act and series of executive orders since the Obama administration provided essential tools, they largely focused on U.S. nationals, which for good reason focused on U.S. nationals, and so there remained no comprehensive legal framework guiding the U.S. engagement or even appropriation to address arbitrary detention for non-U.S. nationals abroad. And that is in the context of our work focusing on arbitrary detention of human rights defenders and citizens across the world. And so, like I mentioned already, we delve into the legal framework and looking at how the executive orders interact with the 11th Act and other existing two pieces of legislation within the U.S. government. And then, as mentioned already, highlight the different parts and branches of the United States government that engages on this issue. And importantly, and this is a part that is really close to our hearts, highlighting the lived experiences of some previously detained individuals, but also one of our case studies, that's Thierry Seng, whose brother Mardi is in the room today, is one that still remains detained. Our team traveled to Cambodia and visited Thierry recently, and just came back with thoughts of her courage and how she continues to push for what she believes is right. And that's the story you see across board. So we share the stories of Mahmoud Hussein, who was arbitrarily detained in Egypt, of Paul Rusesabagina, who was arbitrarily detained in Rwanda, and of Felix Maradiaga, who also is joining us today in the room, and of course of Thierry Seng. And this was a mix of U.S. nationals and non-U.S. nationals. So the guide in part 1, in part 2 and 3 outlines how these government branches engage around arbitrary detention cases, and further, the guide provides a checklist of a list of organizations, most of whom also are represented here today, and a series of tools, of checklists and action tools that families and advocates could use as they prepare or execute their advocacy plans following the detention of a loved one. And so in conclusion, the guide puts forward key policy recommendations, including a call for a legislation that formalizes and strengthens U.S. engagement on arbitrary detention abroad, especially when it relates to non-U.S. nationals, but of course policy recommendations also that focus on making the existing infrastructure clearer and more actionable for U.S. nationals. And to wrap up, I'll just say that this guide is first and foremost a tribute to the tireless work of our friends and partners, particularly those that are listed here and those in the room also, but also for these the heroes who have lived through this and continue to work on this issue. But secondly, it's also a commitment by our RFK Human Rights to continue to work in this space and to take some of the conversations we've had with individuals in this room and those who are not here, especially in addition to representatives of the United States government that also are engaged with us in putting together this guide, to continue that conversation and continue to advance protection for human rights defenders and other individuals who go through arbitrary detention. And just to end, we continue to believe here at RFK Human Rights that arbitrary detention anywhere is a threat to U.S. nationals everywhere, and that the U.S. should do a lot more domestically and abroad to ensure that the challenge of arbitrary detention is addressed. And so I'm grateful that you all are here today to mark this launch, and I really urge everyone to share this guide and please send feedback our way as well as you review the guide. Before I yield the floor to Angelita, please allow me to recognize a colleague of ours who has chose to work today, despite it being her birthday, as we've been working so hard on the guide and other things, just due to her motivation on this course and others. So thank you, Terina, and happy birthday. With that, I'll turn back now to Angelita.
Thank you so much, Ikechukwu, for walking us through the guide, giving us a brief overview of this guide that we're launching today. We hope that everyone that is watching and participating or that will watch this webinar recording afterwards will feel motivated and curious to check out the guide and hopefully incorporate it in their toolbox for human rights protection. So now I have the immense honor of inviting the first of our 4 distinguished experts to discuss the topic of engaging the United States government in cases of arbitrary and wrongful detention abroad. And we will start with Diane Foley, who's the president and founder of the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation. We have shared, or we will share shortly, Diane's bio in the chat. The floor is yours, Diane. Thank you so much again for joining us today.
Thank you, Angelita. I am very honored to join you for to help continue Robert Kennedy's incredible legacy of advocacy for human rights. How I wish I'd had such a guide when we went through our experience. I'd like to share my time today with also the Foley Foundation Director of Hostage Advocacy and Research, Liz Richards. She will join me later. I just want to let people know just briefly what happened to a very ordinary family from New Hampshire. In 2012, our son, James Foley, who was working as a freelance conflict journalist, was kidnapped while working in Syria. He was starved and tortured for nearly 2 years before being beheaded in August 2014 for being an American journalist. And his murder was witnessed on television around the world, literally. Our story has been told in the documentary Jim, the James Foley story, which is streamed on most various streaming services, and in my recent book, American Mother. When Jim was kidnapped on Thanksgiving Day 2012, there was no hostage enterprise. There was actually no one responsible in our government for helping us. So I was quite frantic, quit my job, and began monthly trips to Washington, trying to find someone who would care that Jim had disappeared. And I spent 18 months doing that. However, in spite of my efforts, Jim was beheaded in 2014. And I was really so angry with our government because our government the people I got to meet in Washington repeatedly would tell me Jim was their highest priority. But the reality is our government had already chosen not to negotiate for his release. And so this slide just shows how this all began for us when Jim was so horrifically beheaded in 2014. And I was in shock, but I also felt like our government could do better, that we just had to do something. I felt challenged by Jim, who believed in our government and our country, and by my God. And that's when I felt the need to speak out. I didn't know how to get people's attention, but the shock of Jim's murder gave me a platform, which I attempted to challenge our government to do better. And it was in the course of that time that I had a chance to go to the White House and to tell them, share my disappointment and how I felt we could do better as a government, as did other families who were held with Jim. Stephen Sotloff, Kayla Mueller, and Peter Kassig all experienced the same horror of being abandoned by our government. And Jim, aspired to be a person of moral courage. He wanted to make a difference in the world, and that challenged me. So within 3 weeks of his murder, we established the James Foley Legacy Foundation to advocate for U.S. Nationals who were kidnapped or wrongfully detained abroad, to bring them home. So that was the beginning of our advocacy, which has led to freedom for more than 160 fellow Americans who've been held captive abroad. And that pushed President Obama to reconsider, to look at our current hostage policy, which really didn't include anyone responsible for helping Americans. So that is when President Obama, in June of 2015, established had his staff write the Presidential Policy Directive 30, which actually established the current enterprise. And then afterwards, thanks to the advocacy of the Levinson family, the Robert Levinson Hostage Advocacy and Hostage Taking Act codified the structure that President Obama had proposed. And this shows the progress since that time. The Foley Foundation has led a lot of the advocacy on the Hill, helping establish the Congressional Task Force, and most recently has led to the new flag for hostage and wrongful detainees, and for the day to remember those who never came home and to celebrate those who have returned home. I do have a slide about the current structure. This is the structure that was established by the Presidential Policy Directive in 2015 that shows it's three-pronged, one at the State Department with the Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs, the diplomacy arm, another at more operational, the Hostage Advocacy Fusion Cell, and then the President and National Security Council, where many of the decisions are made of how and what we should negotiate. So this was what was established by that. And now I'd like to turn this over to our research director, Liz Richards, please, to share with you briefly about what our research does. Thank you, Liz.
Hi, thank you, Diane. Because we're talking wrongful detentions today, we thought we'd take a minute and talk about what detentions and what wrongful detentions look like in general for U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents living overseas. We think about it in terms of an inverted pyramid. So every year, the State Department gives a number that's somewhere between 4,000 to upwards of 6,000 or 7,000 American citizens who are arrested every year. And as you can see from the pyramid, the vast majority of those arrests are justified, as in like a crime has been committed in overseas. And consular affairs is involved with those and make sure they get their health and wellness checks. However, we especially here at the Foley Foundation, we argue that there are circumstances where what is going on in that detention are a little grayer. Where we start seeing some of that Levinson Act criteria, where there's evidence that the person may be innocent or being leveraged as a bargaining chip to get concessions from the U.S. government. And at the tip of this inverted pyramid is when the Secretary of State actually designates someone as wrongfully detained. However, we know that it occurs in very rare instances. The State Department said it's only in 0.01% of all arrests where we will actually see a designation. So part of the work we do here at the Foley Foundation is help bring out some of those grayer circumstances and grayer cases and try to elevate them within the U.S. government, within Congress, to get them the time and the attention they need. Because people do not come home on accident. It requires families being proactive. That is one thing our research shows. We also think because the US government isn't transparent in the number of arrests and number of wrongful detention cases, it can add to confusion in conversations, which is one of the reasons that here at the Foley Foundation, since 2019, we have been trying to track this problem and going back decades of it, so we can actually discuss in terms of real numbers how we think this problem of hostage taking and wrongful detention impacts real Americans. So at the beginning of this year, we did a review from 2005 to 2024, so we could do a landscape review for last year. And we've seen a significant increase in the number of reported incidences of hostage taking, this lower line down here, wrongful detention, and then the total overall number of Americans being wrongfully detained or taken hostage overseas. I should say, like, reported incidents means that you can find it in the media, or there are cases that the families come to us and report to that we think align with like a terrorist hostage taking or the Levinson Act. We also recognize that we do not know everything. We are not the US government. There are cases we know that we are not, that we recognize that as an intelligence gap for ourselves. However, that's why we also think it's important for the US government to be more transparent in reporting that, especially because by our own numbers, based on publicly available data, we've seen an increase in these incidents. That has led us to recommend to the US government taking more care and being more thoughtful in how we go about developing a prevention strategy and a deterrence strategy to prevent these continued events from occurring. And with the time we have left, we did want to highlight on the advocacy side the Bring Our Families Home campaign. Now, this campaign is featured in the Robert F. Kennedy Guide, and this is a family-led campaign. And this past Memorial Day, we currently have 9, and we're about to onboard another 10th family. These are family-led campaigns with Americans or for being wrongfully detained overseas, whether or not our US government has declared them. And we just wanted to hold some space today. This video is part of their Freedom Starts with a Name initiative, because we know if their names aren't out in public, if people aren't actually asking about them, how are they doing, and holding our government accountable, they will not come home. You heard mention at the start with the guide, Paul and his family were part of the Bring Our Family Home campaign. And you can see them featured in the guide that the Robert F. Kennedy Foundation has put out. Pending any questions, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz, and thank you so much, Diane. Diane, no words can capture the admiration that we have for you and our enduring solidarity with you and your family for what you have gone through. You're such a leading example of the leadership that often families of victims of arbitrary detention and even worse crimes take in fighting for their loved ones. And so if I may, I just wanted to ask a follow-up question to you. And with all the progress that has been made especially in the past decade at the USG level on this issue, what do you think that the US government could and should do differently, especially to support families of victims of hostages and other victims of arbitrary and wrongful detention?
Well, I think our government, I need to applaud our government in that since the Levinson Act in 2020 and the 2015 when the PPD 30 came out, both sides of the aisle, both Republican and Democrats, have really strived to prioritize the return of American families. Even though Liz is so right, family advocacy, families have to do their part, unfortunately, because there's so much going on in our government. But we do research every year as we uncover more and more of the needs of families. A lot of times families are afraid to let anyone know that someone is taken. There's a lot of fear involved, and the return is very complex. So I feel the biggest need is to look at deterrence. That on one hand, we need to bring people home, but we also need to release numbers so the average citizen knows they're at risk when they travel abroad, so that they realize that they have to really understand where they're going, understand the risk, protect themselves. And we need to work on deterrence as allies. Western allies need to work together towards how can we make it hurt countries like China and Russia, Venezuela, Iran, who target Westerners. So I think that's a huge challenge for our country and the world.
Thank you so much, Diane, again, and we'll get back to you to all the speakers actually at the end after we've heard all of you with some questions that may be coming from those watching today. Now I would like to pass the floor to our next panelist, Jared Genzer, who's the Managing Director at Perseus Strategies LLC. You can also find Jared's full bio in the chat. Jared is a close partner of RFK Human Rights. I cannot resist the temptation to also highlight the nickname. He's known as the Extractor because of his very effective work in obtaining the release of many, many political prisoners around the world. Jared, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much, Angelita, and to RFK Human Rights for this brilliant event today. And I need to begin by saying how grateful I am to have been a partner of RFK Human Rights for, at this point, up to about 20 years now. And we've collaborated on many political prisoner cases over the years. And this guidebook is really an exemplar of exactly the kind of resource that's needed for families, for advocates, for NGOs that want to engage in this kind of work. And so congratulations as a starting point for a job well done. I'm going to focus, of course, on how to engage the U.S. government on arbitrary and wrongful detention cases, most substantially, although I do want to place it within the framework of the other kinds of activities that one, needs to undertake in order to secure the release of prisoners of this kind around the world. And so I'm going to get right to it. In terms of the process for freeing an arbitrary or wrongful detainee, you can just see here some quick kind of boat chart that talks about the different stages in the process, selecting and preparing a case, planning the strategy, implementing a legal approach, applying political pressure, following a public relations strategy, and planning for and securing the release. And so I'm going to talk about each of these phases, no more than a page or two of PowerPoint and cram it all in under 10 minutes. And happy to answer any questions that people might have as well. So let's first begin by talking about preparing a case to develop developing a proper strategy. Obviously, you start with identifying the person. This guidebook is especially focused on helping families, so it's sort of self-evident who the person's going to be. But there are lots of ways that NGOs can find people that are in these kinds of circumstances and to offer assistance. Vetting the case is really important. It's not necessarily as much important for the family who will take on a loved one's case irrespective of the facts. But especially if you're a third party that's going to advocate, you really have to be sure the person is actually innocent of the charges against them. Have they ever used or advocated violence? If either of those things are a problem, if they may have committed the crimes that they're charged with, or they've used or advocated violence, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to get support from the U.S. It is possible in strange facts circumstances, but it's really, really important up front to know what you're going to be saying and what you're going to be doing. You would definitely need to act in all these kinds of cases with the support of the prisoner themselves or of the family. I strongly advise against third parties advocating on behalf of prisoners if they have not touched base with the family, because that work can be very counterproductive. I've had cases I've worked on over the years where an NGO comes out with a statement in support of my client while I'm in the middle of trying to negotiate their freedom with the government, and the government says to me, "This is all orchestrated by you," and so forth. And I almost lost, had the government walk away from a negotiation where I did get that person out within a few weeks because a well-known human rights group went ahead and did this. So this is a very important point. The first part of the work at the very beginning is to get your arms around the facts of the case, right? You need to pull together all the information that you possibly can from every source you possibly can to understand exactly what happened. And either, if you're talking about an American who's wrongly imprisoned abroad, then it's really the best way to frame this is as a set of facts and legal analysis as to why they meet the criteria that are articulated in the Levinson Act. If they're not an American and have no U.S. connection, then it's just a generalized memo. I will emphasize that your facts have to be bulletproof. You could not get one fact wrong, because if you get one fact wrong, you utterly destroy your own credibility. And so I'm always very, very cautious to make sure that everything I'm putting in there, I've double, triple, quadruple checked. And when I'm not sure of something, then I just am very explicit about it. This is the best information that we have right now, or this is my best understanding. But you never want to intentionally, of course, let alone unintentionally, mislead anyone in the U.S. government you're going to engage. And then lastly, you need to think about developing the strategy. I'm a process expert for freeing political prisoners and wrongly imprisoned Americans. And sometimes I work in a case in a country I've never worked in before. And so you really need to understand the country, its leader, how that government relates to other countries and regional organizations. Why does it engage with the international community? What is its relationship with the U.S. and what are points of leverage and so forth? And it's only with that background information that you're actually well positioned to be able to take up one of these cases and be successful and effective. So now let me just turn to legal strategy. There are lots of different legal routes to pursue. I'm not going to dwell on this because the focus is obviously on engaging the U.S. government. But the best known mechanism, which is one of the UN special procedures, is the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. It's the fastest. It can be a year or less sometimes, and does not require a case to have gone through a final judgment of the Supreme Court. You can take up a case. You want to wait at least a little bit of time through a domestic legal proceeding, but you can take up a case when there have been egregious abuses that have been present and the detention is clearly arbitrary. I put a QR code there of my book. It's actually available for free online, 650 pages, 6,000 footnotes, 5 case study examples, more than you would ever want to know about taking a case to the working group. But I'm really, really glad to have been able to provide that for free to advocates around the world. There are also lots of other regional human rights courts you can take cases to, but they have many more requirements, especially exhausting domestic remedies. There are also other UN special procedures you can go to, depending on the facts of a case, if someone's disappeared, if they're being tortured. And so, ultimately, these are really primarily the only mechanisms that have any potential value, because in cases that we're talking about here of potentially wrongfully imprisoned Americans and other political prisoners, the domestic legal process, while it may formally exist, is going to result in the person's conviction, and you generally know that up front. And so while you have to fight those cases to some extent domestically, obviously you can't rely on them in any way. So now let me just talk about the crux of what this amazing guide is about and my own experience integrated together into U.S. government engagement. So if you think about engaging the executive branch, one of the most important things that I've found that can be very effective and helpful is to engage in the beginning of the process with NGOs, think tanks, the UN, regional organizations, foreign governments, et cetera, because any statement of support that you can get from any of these organizations can help persuade the U.S. government to jump in on a case. If it's an imprisoned American, they will take a look at it immediately. But again, it helps a lot if there are positive media stories or other support that you can either begin with or ultimately grow. When you're engaging advocacy in the executive branch, you have to understand the interests of who you're talking to, and you have to tailor your messages. I don't give different messages to anybody. I mean, the cases are the cases and the facts are the facts, but I do try to understand where is the person coming from and what might be most compelling to them. And you always want to have at least one ask for every meeting, and definitely never more than 1 or 2 asks. You need to figure out what is it this person could do to help you, and you need to go right for that. While there are differences in approaches across presidential administrations, I've worked very effectively with this current Trump administration on a number of cases, with the prior Biden administration, the Trump administration before that, and so forth. As long as you keep your work strictly nonpartisan, there should be no reason why any U.S. government, any executive branch of it, for any president, should not be willing to help you and support you. Different presidents have different kinds of interests. I mean, honestly, I would say President Trump, in my experience, is a lot more interested in getting Americans home in terms of his personal involvement in these cases than President Biden was. And that's undoubtedly not a partisan comment in any way, but just simply my own experience having tried to engage both administrations with these kinds of cases. So on the executive branch side, and again, I'm not going to spend much time on it, the guidebook goes through this in enormous detail, but the State Department, of course, the SPIHA office for AMSITs and legal permanent residents, the regional bureaus. DRL used to be an important point of contact. Unfortunately, it has been reduced now to like maybe a dozen people. So, and they also have the authority to impose travel bans on bad actors as well. Sometimes they're envoys for particular regions of the world. And so if you're loved one or the person you're going to help is in one of those parts of the world, then you can go there as well. For the White House, of course, as you see here, a lot of different ways to come at it. And then the Treasury Department, of course, has, when you're talking about broader situations, the ability to do that as well. And so, for the legislative branch, again, sorry, yeah. Yeah, for the legislative branch, it's critical to think about the consequences of, engaging the government and speaking out, because obviously there are pros and cons to speaking out at different times, and there can be consequences for the person detained. Here you have, both, a way to think about targeting specific members, that might be interested, as well as needing to understand the target's interests and concerns and having those tailored messages. And then this is just a quick list of all the different ways that you can think about engaging the executive branch, individual members, and doing hearings and briefings. And these are all methods that I've used and RFK Human Rights has used over the course of our advocacy on this kind of work. Again, well summarized in the report itself. So let me just come to the end rather quickly here and talk about media engagement. The question is whether and when to go public, and it really requires a lot of thought because, again, there can be consequences for the person who's being detained. Typically you can't obviously ungo public. Like once you've done it, it's happened, right? And so if there are ways up front in a case to try to work it out through diplomatic engagement, you want to exhaust those mechanisms, not for more than probably 2 or 3 months, maybe 4 if you're on the cusp of something happening, but you definitely want to give any opportunity for private diplomacy to work. And you also really have to prime the pump, which means regularly sharing information, either off the record or on background with journalists as the case develops that journalists are interested in. These are all different kinds of ways you can work with the media, pitching op-eds from different people involved in the case in one way or another, pitching columnists to write about the cases, putting out press releases at different times. Again, all of these things that are listed here are things that I've done on these kinds of cases over my career. You can also look at press briefings as well. Again, every case is fact specific. I'm not going to talk about preparing for the potential release, but I would just, except to just say that reentry is very, very difficult for people who have gone through these circumstances. In a lot of cases with political prisoners, they're going to stay in their own country where even their own family might not be supportive of them and say, see, look, you went to jail for no reason. The situation is very much the same. And for those who come out of a country, like an American who's been wrongly detained abroad, reentry is also incredibly difficult and challenging. And I think that understanding that, giving the person the space and the ability to heal at their own pace, doing everything possible to ensure that they get psychological services and support, both individually and potentially with family members. All of this is really, really important to try to address what in most cases is, serious, post-traumatic stress disorder and a wide array of other both physical and mental health problems that they can face to kind of reorient themselves to the world. I'll just lastly conclude with an important observation, which is that the work that we're talking about here is incredibly hard, but obviously when you're representing your own loved one or you're helping a family directly, you can't fail. Obviously, sometimes you do. In the real world, you do fail. And I've had a number of clients of mine tragically die in prison, but you can't think about that prospect. You have to think about your success in getting there, and you obviously can't give up. And so you have to persevere. And I think, Nelson Mandela, of course, said it best. It always seems impossible until it is done. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Jared. And if I can ask you just a quick follow-up question, and this without prejudice of any other questions that the public may have for you or the other speakers, but you started by mentioning other actions before other mechanisms, and I wanted to get from you a little bit of your thoughts on how useful it is to have a favorable decision from a UN mechanism like the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention or a regional mechanism, human rights body to persuade the US government to engage with a particular case. And if it's useful, do you think that has changed in the current context in the US, or you still think it's helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, especially because the domestic legal proceeding is almost always in these cases going to result in a conviction. Anything you can have from really anywhere, from NGOs, from the UN, from regional organizations speaking out and talking about the person's detention being arbitrary or illegal under international law helps a lot. And, it is but I would also say that it's sort of a necessary but not necessarily sufficient condition. There are a lot of people I know that have litigated cases at the working group on arbitrary detention and somehow think that will be sufficient. And the reality is that those judgments are really only worth what you make of them. If you talk to the whole world and in all your advocacy say the UN says this person's arbitrarily detained and has to be immediately released, then you can make it into a lot more than it necessarily is. In my 50 plus cases that I've taken to the working group, in only 2 cases have the person gotten out within 2 weeks of the UN judgment coming down. And in every other case, it's taken, longer. I will say in the current context that, while obviously this administration has a different point of view, towards international law and towards the UN human rights system, I found, not yet with this current administration, but with the last Trump administration and with the Biden administration, it's just too early days with this one, that judgments from the UN are very helpful, especially if they reinforce the views and experiences of people within the administration towards certain things. The working group comes out with judgments, for example, many years ago on Guantanamo Bay that U.S. government officials at the time under President Obama, shall we say, were none too happy with and rejected out of hand. And the same can go, obviously, for President Trump or other Republican presidents in the past or in the future. But, I represented previously Aung San Suu Kyi from 2006 to 2010. And, the judgments that we had, from the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention on her case, weren't just embraced by Laura Bush and President Bush, who cared a lot about it, but resulted in press releases being issued by, the National Security Council welcoming the judgment of the working group on arbitrary detention on Aung San Suu Kyi's case. So obviously this was long before her complicity in the Rohingya genocide. But I do think that these judgments are helpful. In a worst case scenario, it's not going to harm you in any way with this administration, in my view. They may not, care about it as much as the prior version of the Trump administration. But at the end of the day, winning a case at the working group can only be a positive thing. And converting that into, a successful set of advocacy, is a different question. But I do think that these judgments and these perspectives being put out by UN bodies and other regional organizations is important. But lastly, I'll just note that it doesn't have to just be a legal judgment. Even having, for example, a person's name in a resolution of the European Parliament, right, for example, as being arbitrarily detained, is also very valuable to bring to U.S. government officials to lobby, because what you're able to do is to say, hey, look, it isn't just me, the advocate, or me, the family member, saying that this person is wrongly detained. Look at all the different places, NGOs, media, regional organizations, legal bodies, all of them saying the same thing, and that creates a greater urgency for action on the part of the U.S. government.
Thank you, Jared. And I think this is a great segue to our next speaker, who is Dr. Alina Steinarte, who's a member of the UN Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture and also a former chair, rapporteur, and member of the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. She's also a visiting fellow at Bristol University. You can find her full bio on the chat. Dr. Steinarte, please, the floor is yours.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon. It is really a pleasure to be at this distinguished panel. Thank you very much for inviting me. I think, especially noting what Jared just said in relation to the working group on arbitrary detention, and noting that I have been part and had the honor to serve the working group on arbitrary detention for 6 years in the past, I think it will come to no surprise that I will take this opportunity to reflect on the opportunities and challenges that the mandate of the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention presents to tackle the phenomena of arbitrary detention worldwide. I think from the outset, it is crucial to recall that it is indeed a matter of general principle of international law that which is at the heart of the mandate of the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, that the prohibition of arbitrary detention, arbitrary deprivation of liberty, shall I say, is absolute and indeed forms part of customary international law. We see the prohibition of arbitrary detention in Universal Declaration, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We see it in regional human rights treaties, and of course in numerous domestic constitutions and other pieces of legislation. And indeed, I think it is fair to say that there is no country in this world that would claim that arbitrary deprivation of liberty is allowed. which of course is very different from having a universal agreement as to when, under what circumstances, a deprivation of a liberty becomes arbitrary. Now, turning to the work of the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, which now spans across some 35 years, the working group has made it clear that broadly speaking, instances of arbitrary detention can be grouped in sort of 5 cohorts, which the working group in our language called categories. This is not to indicate any priority among them, but simply to group the cases together. So in the category 1, the working group considers those instances when detention lacks legal basis, with the term legal basis being understood more broadly to encompass the principle of legal certainty as well. Under category 2, the working group considers cases when detention results from peaceful exercise of rights, such as freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, or freedom of religion, for example. Under category 3, the cases are grouped when detention results from a trial which is so deficient of fundamental fair trial guarantees that the subsequent detention is arbitrary. This is usually more than one violation of the fair trial guarantees, as the working group is looking for the gravity of fair trial violations, so that together these render the detention subsequent to such trial arbitrary. Under category 4, the working group considers prolonged administrative detention in the migration context without the possibility of appeal. And finally, under category 5 comes the detention which is based on discrimination, be this detention on the basis of race, nationality, gender, sexual orientation, for example, or indeed any other status. And this is a very important term which I shall revisit in just a little bit. Now, the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention is among the oldest of the UN Human Rights Council special procedures established in 1991, and yet its workload in receiving and considering allegations of arbitrary detention has not diminished. Indeed, on the contrary, it has grown exponentially and continues to grow with allegations of arbitrary deprivation of liberty arriving from all corners of the globe. Now, the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, however, is unique among the UN special procedures, because it is the only one of the currently 46 thematic mandates which has this quasi-judicial function. The working group may receive allegations from individuals or their families, representatives, concerning allegations of arbitrary detention, so from anywhere in the world. And the working group is mandated to consider such and make an assessment as to whether the allegations as presented to it, and it is important here to recall that the state concerned, or sometimes number of states concerned, have the right to respond. So on the basis of assessment of the allegations, the response from the state, the working group makes an assessment as to whether the allegations amount to arbitrary detention, as per one of the 5 categories to which I alluded at the start. And it does so with the reference to the Universal Declaration and other international human rights obligations binding upon the state or states concerned. And the outcome of such assessment is a public opinion of the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, so a UN mechanism which sets out the allegations, the response of the state, and the legal analysis of the working group and its conclusion as to whether there has been an arbitrary detention. Now, all of this is particularly important because the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has a global reach, because the working group derives its mandate from the Human Rights Council resolution. This mandate is not dependent on whether a particular state has ratified any particular human rights treaty. And given that many states around the world fail to be states parties to such key instruments as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the working group and the mandate of the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention becomes particularly significant for individuals in such countries with more than scarce ratification record of international human rights treaties. And for these individuals, the working group truly becomes the only avenue for redress, the only chance to raise the allegations of arbitrary detention and receive an objective international appraisal from an internationally mandated body as to what has happened. Now, the recent decade or so has certainly presented the working group with more and more challenging cases of arbitrary detention, where detention is being deployed as a tool to silence, to lock away those who challenge the ruling elites, regimes, those who dare to speak out and present opinions and views which are different from the mainstream, uncomfortable to those in power. Arbitrary detention has become a tool which is aimed especially at political opponents, at human rights defenders, at journalists who dare to challenge what is not being challenged or shed the light on those in power, or what those in power rather would very much prefer to be wrapped in the dark and remain there. Now, in some cases, the governments have gone to great lengths to secure the custody of such persons, whom they see as these uncomfortable, as I use it in inverted commas, as threats, so that the working group on arbitrary detention has seen a rise of cases which involve abductions and cross-border transfers, which would be impossible without explicit or tacit consent of the other state. And of course, when I use the word transfers, I use this term very loosely, as none of such follow the regular extradition procedures. And indeed, there is very rarely any paper trace of such transfers. Now, these detentions, of course, are not just about locking away those particular individuals. They are accompanied by trumped-up charges to discredit, to silence, often linked to opaque allegations of national security and terrorism, based on legislation formulated in such a vague and imprecise terms that it does not withstand even the most basic fundamental requirements of legal certainty. Now, they are accompanied often by most disproportionate imprisonment sentences running into decades, imposed through trials, often lasting just mere hours, frequently conducted behind closed doors, and in absence of any meaningful independent legal assistance to the accused. All of this, of course, is aimed at discrediting those who have dared to speak out, to silence dissent, different political opinion, and is expression. But also it is about silencing anyone else who might dare to even think about doing something similar. It is a most chilling warning to anyone else in the society. Now, in the past years, the cases concerning arbitrary detention of human rights defenders constitute roughly 20% of cases received by the working group. And notably, in such cases, the working group always has found that human rights defenders have been arbitrarily detained precisely because they are human rights defenders, precisely because of their activities in support of human rights. And this is where I return to that category 5, to that other status point that I made earlier. Because detention based on discrimination, as the working group has taken this step further and made it very clear that being a human rights defender is that other status, which is also protected specifically by this overall protection of prohibition against discrimination. In other words, the detention of human rights defenders because of their status as human rights defenders is detention also based on discrimination, which is arbitrary international law. Now, the action from states in engaging actively and proactively with cases of arbitrary detention without doubt is crucial. And we see the effects and significant impact towards positive resolution to cases of arbitrary detention described in this very important guide, the launch of which we are here to mark today. I'm truly impressed and indeed inspired by the detailed approach adopted by the authors of the guide in suggesting concrete actions for engaging various levels of authorities and targeted actions which may yield results. Because the reality is such that while the working group on arbitrary detention, for example, can and does adopt these opinions in cases of arbitrary deprivation of liberty, the rate at which states are actually implementing those opinions leaves quite a lot to desire. The working group on arbitrary detention has no real enforcement tools at its disposal. And while, of course, the working group does request the states to report on the actions taken to implement the opinions, there is very little more the working group can do. And yes, each annual report of the working group contains a public account of opinions adopted and actions taken by states concerned to implement such opinions. But, for example, the last year's annual report of the working group recorded 40% response rate from the states. But the response rate in itself does not actually indicate full or even partial implementation of the opinion. Not that 40% in any case would be the ultimate aim. And this is why I'm especially excited about the prospect which this guide presents, as it is a detailed action plan with concrete proposals on how to engage US authorities with cases of arbitrary detention worldwide, cases which far too often involve arbitrary detention being used as a tool, also a tool against the US citizens because of their nationality as well. And so I applaud the RFK Human Rights for their meticulous effort, not only in fighting cases of arbitrary detention, but also in compiling this most useful tool for anyone else on how to do the same. And I very much look forward to the guide being put to use. Dear colleagues, arbitrary detention is not a practice which occurs openly. No state, no authority, at least none that I have witnessed, neither during my 6 years of service to the working group's mandate, nor since, nor indeed prior, has ever come out with a public statement, yes, we carry arbitrary detentions. Arbitrary detention is a practice which is always vigorously denied, and the allegations of which are always rigorously contested by all states. But it is also a phenomena which is impossible to eradicate without concrete and targeted efforts of states. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alina. And taking advantage that we have you, I would like to ask you, you kind of addressed it, but maybe if you could elaborate more on how specifically the US government engagement on the issue of arbitrary and wrongful detention worldwide can complement and reinforce the work of bodies, UN bodies like the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, for example, given these big challenges of compliance and even response to inquiries and decisions from this body in particular.
Absolutely. I think one of the most staggering points which I found during my time of the working group was when you present the annual report, there are opportunities for states to ask questions. Ask questions also of each other as to what have you done about this case. And let us not forget that in international relations, quite a lot hinges on these states to states, peer-to-peer pressure. And as also I think Jared made very clear how much that can actually influence the shift in certain cases and actually provide a positive resolution. A lot can be achieved behind closed doors, but there is also a lot to be said in these open forums. And I think in these cases, also what is very important, leaving aside the state engagement, I always think that at the end of every opinion adopted by the human rights, by procedures like the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, is a human being. And for that human being to have that hope that my case is still has this light shed upon it is very, very important. Now, I'm very encouraged also by such steps as the Canadian Declaration on the use of arbitrary detention in interstate relations, which is a relatively new initiative, which the US has also joined now. I think it's just roughly over 80 states which are part of this also network and platform for the implementation of the declaration, which looks precisely at these mechanisms, how at the diplomatic level and engagement, practical engagement and work between states, the concrete resolutions, positive resolutions to instances of arbitrary detention can be brought about. And this is very important because at the end of the day, we are talking about human beings. And every day in arbitrary detention matters.
Thank you again so much. And now, last but not least, I would like to give the floor to our final panelist, Andrew Fandiño, who's the Advocacy Director for Individuals at Risk at Amnesty International USA, also a long-time partner and wonderful human rights defender himself. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much, RFK, for organizing this amazing webinar and for inviting me to speak. And also congratulations on producing this very important guide on engaging the U.S. government on arbitrary and wrongful detention abroad. As my esteemed colleagues mentioned, this guide is an incredibly helpful tool for family members, NGOs, and policymakers alike to be able to navigate the many different paths that one can take in trying to, get an individual who has been arbitrarily detained released. So I was asked to reflect on this endeavor from a civil society perspective. As you probably all know, Amnesty International has been working on getting people released from arbitrary detention dating back to 1961 when we were first founded. And we've helped to get thousands of prisoners of conscience released since then. But as Diane mentioned at the beginning, back then, there was no guide or webinar to help. Many of the programs and offices that have been mentioned and discussed today and that are mentioned in the guide did not even exist back then either. So civil society organizations and family members played and continue to play a key role in pushing the US government to support individuals that have been arbitrarily detained, to call for their release, and to, very importantly, as we have all mentioned, to take action. Civil society organizations are usually the first ones that know about these cases. They're in touch with the family members, their legal counsel. In many instances, they might even know the imprisoned individuals themselves. And as such, civil society organizations play a key role in connecting people with the US government and helping in that engagement. There has been great strides over the last few decades in recognizing and addressing this important human rights issue. Unfortunately, at the same time, we're also seeing more and more countries using this repressive tactic to silence critics, journalists, opposition leaders, and human rights defenders. People around the world are being sent to jail and the keys being thrown away. As we heard today, and that we all know, arbitrary detention of one person does not limit its impact to just that one person. Families are devastated, colleagues are scared, and communities are shattered. The chilling effect, as was mentioned before, is much broader, and that's its intended purpose after all, to silence, to stop, and to deter. The current environment is even more challenging than ever. Family members are facing countless reprisals, such as being heavily surveilled, threatened, attacked, thrown in prison themselves, and in some cases even facing transnational repression. Civil society organizations that help these individuals and their family members are all that have been arbitrarily detained are also being targeted with growing pressure in country. NGOs are being targeted with restrictive laws, financial restrictions, being accused of being foreign agents, targeted in smear campaigns, and in many cases, having their own staff attacked or arrested as well. And that's why it's essential that we all work together to address these pressing human rights issues, especially in the current environment where there is less financial resources and staff to work on cases of arbitrary detention. We all need to collaborate and coordinate more on these cases, and we should not work in silos, which unfortunately happens way too often. We should strategize and take action together, and we can make a bigger impact collectively. And I think the guide has an amazing array of information that kind of outlines all the different strategies that we can take on working on behalf of arbitrary detention. And I wanted just to kind of recommend a few things that I think my colleagues mentioned before and that are in the guideline that I would just like to emphasize in terms of some recommendations that the US government can do in response to arbitrary detention. I mean, some of these programs and work is already doing just kind of the emphasizing in this current climate of why it's important to maintain those or improve them or increase the work. So for the US Congress, as Diane mentioned in this slide, it's very important to get members of Congress and their staff to continue to meet with family members and former political and detainees and organizations that support the family members that are detained abroad, and for them to take action on their behalf. This can be informally or formally through such congressional programs as the Defending Freedoms Project, which is mentioned before and is in the guidebook, and happy to provide more information on that as Amnesty was one of the founding organizations that helped to put the Defending Freedoms Project together. What is key in whichever form that happens is that that action is taken. Congress plays a key role in helping to bring these cases to light and forcing governments to take action that otherwise they might not want to. So as was mentioned in that list before, having floor statements, social media posts, resolutions, dear colleague letters, raising cases during CODELs, and writing broader legislation supporting human rights defenders and prisoners of conscience are all vital tools in raising cases of people that are detained arbitrarily and help substantially to helping to get these people released. Much more can and should be done by Congress. As for the State Department, it's critical that the State Department and U.S. embassies worldwide continue to meet with and advocate on behalf of individuals that are arbitrarily detained. You can see that's kind of a theme here of making sure that the family members have direct access to key policymakers and to hear those voices. As we all know, it is critical to having those voices directly there and for them to speak for themselves. And it has a much more stronger impact and the commitment from those that are in policy decision-making circles. The State Department can play an important role in both deterrence and response, denouncing both in public and privately the criminalization and judicial harassment of individuals, but also broader legislation that restricts and closes civic space are key in helping to prevent arbitrary detentions from happening in the first place. It is vital that the State Department continues to also strongly denounce both publicly and privately once an individual has been arbitrarily detained and call for their immediate and unconditional release. But there are many other things that the U.S. Embassy can and has done to support individuals who have been arbitrarily detained. Embassy staff can and should. And again, this is just to really hone on this premise that they should meet with family members and the legal counsel and the organizations that support them in country. They can also push to make sure that they visit these individuals in detention, check on the individual's conditions, see if they have access to their family, legal counsel, medical attention, and if those things are not available, to push that those are made available. Very importantly, the U.S. embassies can help by attending individual hearings and observing trials are super critical. And we know that in a lot of times that has actually helped to lead to direct positive outcomes when there is a presence of the international community there. I could go on and on the many different things that the embassy could do to support and have done to support arbitrarily detained abroad. Many of these actions you can actually see in different documents and policies that the State Department has. We just wanted to mention one that is also referred in this amazing guide, and it's the State Department's guidelines on U.S. diplomatic missions in support of civil society and human rights defenders. That is a great guide that outlines many of these different steps that can help to support individuals and specifically human rights defenders, but I think has many practices that can more broadly be applied to those that are arbitrarily detained. So one essential thing would be to making sure, as part of that recommendations, making sure that the State Department maintains and continues to implement the guidelines on human rights defenders. It's also very important that both the regional bureaus and DRL continue to do this work in raising cases, both publicly and privately, and call for individuals' release. That has been something that we continue to see that has a great impact on the release of individuals and getting improving the conditions in prison. Also, very importantly, and again, I think this was mentioned in the guidebook as well, but I think just for people to be more aware of them as well, to continue such official programs as State Department's Without Just Cause on political prisoners campaign is also very helpful in being able to highlight the different kind of cases throughout the world. And as obviously as my colleague Diane had mentioned before, to continue to support the critical work of SPIHA's office in helping to bring U.S. nationals back home. And last but not least, but also fundamental, that with the support foreign assistance programs and funding that supports all the programs that have been mentioned above. It's important that they're fully funded and staffed to ensure the State Department and embassies have the resources necessary to be able to help individuals that have been arbitrarily detained. I know I'm kind of running a bit on time, just really quickly on the National Security Council and White House. I know that it's also very important to have, when possible, national security advisors be able to continue to raise key emblematic cases of concern during private closed-door conversations with foreign governments. We have seen that has also helped to, bring the release or improve the conditions substantially of individuals that have been arbitrarily detained. I think I'll stop there. Happy to answer any questions, and just thank you for organizing this event. And yeah, back to you, Angelita.
Thank you, Andrew, so much. I just wanted to ask you a bit more about, in particular, the situation of human rights defenders that become victims of arbitrary detention. And the U.S. government has guidelines, as you mentioned, for embassy and consular staff, but in practice, and that's my our impression, but it's very inconsistent, no? And so depending on the particular consular and embassy team, they will be more likely to really follow those guidelines or not. Do you have any, can you elaborate a little bit more? Is this a wrong assessment, and how do you think that can be addressed moving forward?
Yes, yes. Unfortunately, that is something that we come across, that the guidelines and just general awareness of the guidelines is not very well known. So I think continuing to have that mainstreamed and having U.S. missions awareness of that is important. I think even besides the guidelines, even before they were created, I think just the universality of these policies and these best practices are important, irregardless of the very real but challenging real politics of the region. We do see that some countries are criticized more than others, and that is very very difficult for being able to raise cases. And so I think it's important that no matter what the policies are and programs and policies that are in place, that they're applied universally, and making sure that no matter where you are, if you're arbitrarily detained, that you will get the same services that the government will denounce when that will and help to make sure that you're released. And so that would be my main point on that.
Thank you so much. And now we have a few minutes left. It would be great if, of course, if any of the participants and audience have any questions. We have received a few, so I'll get us started. There's one question that is directed at Jared. And it is, over the last 2 decades, we have seen an increase in wrongful detention in more countries than before. Do you think this trend will continue? And is there a way you think stakeholders could mitigate the spread of this practice? Tough question.
Yeah, I mean, undoubtedly there has been, also an explosion of mass detention situations. If you think, for example, about the Uyghurs in China, or the Rohingya in these massive camps inside Burma. North Korea, of course, has had for many decades their own Kwanli-So and other detention camps as well. I do think that one aspect of this, though, is that it isn't just about increasing numbers of detentions, which I think is correct, but also part of that increase is obviously the greater transparency that we have in the world that we live in today, with everyone having access to a cell phone, not everyone, but countless people around the world having access to a cell phone and getting phones into places that otherwise wouldn't have previously ever had that possibility. And so I think for parts of the world that have been slower in terms of being able to afford or adopt, emerging tech and even just mobile phones, we're understanding the landscape a lot better than the way to do it before. In terms of solutions, I mean, there are obviously no easy solutions. I think, it's going to be a long, hard struggle. I mean, with the number of authoritarian regimes in the world that see arbitrary detention as a critical tool of repression. But I think that, developing mechanisms that are not just U.S. based and U.S. focused. I think the U.S. is pretty far along when it comes, for example, to protecting their own hostages. But as RFK Human Rights points out, brilliantly in the report and the guide that it just put out, there is no, for example, in the U.S. Or any other country in the world that I'm aware of, architectures that have been set up to support the political prisoners around the world, domestic homegrown political prisoners. And I do think that my own experience and why I got into this work in the first place is what I found is that by careful case selection and taking up cases of people whose abuses are representative of a broader set of abuses in a country, you could have a ripple effect of impact, ultimately getting them out so they can return to their work, but also highlighting the set of issues that their detention spotlights, whether it be the prison of a journalist or a religious freedom activist or a political leader and so forth. And so I do think that the world needs to catch up with the increasing amount of political prisoners being created in the world. And we need to do that by being much more focused and systematic in how we handle these kinds of cases and advocate for them around the world.
Thank you, Jared. And this is another question which, could be answered also by you and Liz, Andrew, even Dr. Steiner, on the issue of the care and support to those that survive arbitrary detention or wrongful detention, because of course a lot of the focus is on victims when they are detained and then not so much on what happens next. And some of you addressed a bit that particular concern. And so it would be great to hear from you if there's any particular suggestions, ideas, advice on how these could also be better addressed, and particularly by the US government, but obviously other governments and mechanisms as well. Any takers? Otherwise, maybe Liz, you could, if you have anything to share.
I know how we take care of returnees is a big concern that we have, and we're hoping to start the research to do a full paper focused just on that later this year. In our past reports, we've always addressed it and included some of those questions, but it's been a page or two, and we know the issue is a lot more in depth. And we know it touches a bunch of things, not just like the physical health of the person who comes back and their mental health, but their financial health as well, making sure that they're able, like when they hit the ground and if they've gone through post-isolation support activities, once they leave that, what is their guide path to fully rebuilding their life and reintegrating back in society? And we take reintegration so importantly when someone's coming out of our own criminal justice system, and there are programs in place at the state level. But we don't have that right now for people who have been wrongfully detained or held hostage overseas. And again, we see that as a critical gap right now. And we do believe that before we can address some of that, you need to do the foundational research, figure out what the population, the returnees themselves say those gaps are, and then help educate the states and lawmakers on what else we can be doing. And I'll applaud I know you can look, like some returnees have been speaking out on this issue. I know Paul Whelan has done a lot of NPR interviews on this, highlighting some of those gaps and the struggles that they're facing. So I would really encourage like more research in this area, and policymakers, if they're interested. We know like Chris Coons has sponsored some bills to take care of some of the gaps with Social Security and the problems individuals have had with like sorting out their tax and credit scores when coming back. But we do think there's more work to be done. Thank you.
If I can just make a brief addition, I've been working with the NGOs, Dream.org and the Reform Alliance, on advancing social reintegration as a human rights question of the Human Rights Council. And the focus is really on the fact that we have, 11, 12 million people in prison around the world, most of whom are eventually going to come out of prison, and all of them need to be socially reintegrated back into society. Historically, this has been looked at by UNODC as a question of recidivism reduction and not as a question of human rights. And the Human Rights Council adopted a historic resolution, last year that has now commissioned the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to prepare a report on this topic. That also includes a request to examine the idea of developing a set of UN guiding principles on social reintegration. And there are obviously various subsets of people who need to be socially reintegrated, vulnerable populations that include, of course, political prisoners or former hostages. And there are obviously specific and unique needs to that population, but the broader effort to advance social reintegration as an international human right, as protected by both treaties and soft law frameworks, I think is going to create a greater focus on this. I've also engaged with the working group on arbitrary detention to see if it might be possible for them to consider adding an additional element to their standardized text that they put in a judgment when a person has been found to be held arbitrarily in violation of international law, that needs to have a sentence or two in there on the need for the relevant support necessary to properly be able to socially reintegrate back into society. So I think this is a much bigger issue than just narrowly on the question of political prisoners and hostages. And I think that, we can do a lot of good work, I think, to ensure that the particular needs of these populations are incorporated into those broader discussions.
Thank you, Jared.
Can I
And
just very quickly
Of course.
also very quickly add here that I think it is very important to recall that the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention did adopt this deliberation specifically in relation to remedies for arbitrary deprivation of liberty, which actually does also encompass the aspects of resocialization. But I think within the broader UN system, I'm really grateful, Jared, for you for mentioning this, is this new report of the Office of the High Commissioner, which is going to have this more global aspect. And I think here we indeed see this point that resocialization, it's not just about addressing recidivism, it is also about the victims of the crime and how these people are being integrated back into the society, and how difficult it is when you have spent years and years and often decades in the prison for no valid reason whatsoever. That injustice takes much more to be undone.
Yeah,
Thank
maybe I could. Leslie, just wanted to add that, yeah, one of the things that Amnesty tries to do in cases that we work with is obviously address that very critical aspect of the psychosocial mental health services, and making sure when returned that they have access to that in their country or in another country if they're not able to there domestically. Obviously, I think there's also the responsibility of the state in terms of the remedies and reparations and providing those services. Unfortunately, in most cases, it is civil society who is filling that gap and providing those resources. But it's the state's obligation to actually provide that. And we see a few hearings in a few cases where a judgment, but usually that takes years to get that at that stage. And obviously they need immediate assistance in those cases. And I think it's as a civil society organization, I think one of the key things that we always try to emphasize is making sure that, as Jared mentioned, making sure that family members and the individuals that are released, that they are given the space and support that they need, and in all the different categories that you could imagine, and just being very mindful of that. I think sometimes as civil society as well, when an individual is released, they might want to even go and visit the different policymakers to help to get them released, and just like how dramatic a lot of times that can be. I mean, I've seen in many cases where organizations that haven't done that prep and make sure that they have received the proper mental services, they'll do like in meeting after meeting, recounting the trauma that they were faced, and really being triggered about having to do that and not being able to finish meetings. And so I think it's very important that we're all very mindful on that process and making sure that that they feel, that they've gotten the proper treatment, that they are, feel comfortable, and always checking in, I think, is really important to making sure how comfortable an individual feels. Because just recounting everything that they have been, gone through, and as was mentioned, that, for years, even decades, and what that effect has, and just being very careful and mindful of that, I think, is really critical.
Thank you, Andre. We just have a few minutes left, and it's a question that may require a whole webinar on itself, as you can all see on the Q&A. Regarding the deportation of immigrants that are who are detained in U.S. detention centers and have been sent to third countries, with also the concern of being deported back to their countries of origin, which have in many cases very difficult and dangerous conditions, and the risk of torture, among other things, is very high. So I don't want to misrepresent the question, it's very long, but I think maybe just because of time constraints, Dr. Stein, are there any pointers to anyone interested in using UN mechanisms, and particularly the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, how to make a more effective use of them, including for a situation like this that we're experiencing right now in the US and other countries in the region?
Yeah, it's a very difficult one, actually, and many layers in that question. So this is more than broad brush, very, very broad brush answer. But one of the things that I think, although, as Jared said, Working Group on Arbitrary Detention is one of the mechanisms which is able to act more quickly in comparison to other international adjudicatory mechanisms. For such immigration cases, we are not quick enough, because we are talking about imminent deportation. The working group will take some time, and by time I actually mean a few months at least, to actually even get a grips with the case. So in these sort of cases, I'm afraid that the UN mechanisms simply don't have that quick, rapid reaction agility. Also, what we need to remember is that mechanisms like Working Group on Arbitrary Detention don't have built in within the mandate so-called precautionary measures, which might put at least attempt, whether the state will comply with it is a different question, but at least attempt to put in a kind of injunction upon the ability of the state to act. From the legal point of view, of course, we have to remember that the obligation of non-refoulement is absolute and applies to all states, and it has to be implemented in good faith, not through an attempt to circumvent it by going slightly to a different direction and thus avoiding the fundamental obligation of non-refoulement. This obligation stands.
Thank you so much. And again, yes, it's a complex, broader question but thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I think it's time to wrap up, to be respectful of your time and also the time of the audience. Thank you so much again, all of you, for joining us today, especially to our distinguished speakers. Each one of you has contributed so much from your different roles to fighting the horrible practice of arbitrary and wrongful detention worldwide. I invite you not only to check out our guide on engaging the US government on arbitrary and wrongful detention cases, which has now officially been launched today and is available in our website, but also to check out the amazing resources that our speakers shared in the chat or mentioned during their respective interventions. I want to also thank my wonderful colleagues who work very hard on this guide, starting with the leadership of Ikechukwu Uzoma, the months-long work by Sarah Morsheimer, and the great reinforcement of that work by Basil Jamali and Tarina Ahuja. I also want to thank all those colleagues who have helped us organize today's webinar, including Esihe Chikwere, Alex Kapati, and Alexis Kapati, and our wonderful comms and operations teams. Thank you all again, and we wish you a wonderful day. Thank you so much to you all.